Far Eastern University, Manila. My name is April De Peña, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. We are very much happy to continue organizing events such as this webinar, especially because we're able to somehow make the most of our time despite some challenges brought by the global pandemic. So far, we're able to have great discussions, like in our past webinars through a number of renowned international speakers. How amazing it is to experience as well the virtual world without the need for us to travel outside the country. This time, we'd like you all again to enjoy another round of noteworthy discussion. And to start, let's all welcome Dr. Maria Teresa Trinidad Pitino, Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, for the opening remarks.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, dear students and Your Excellency, Ambassador Kell. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all today's webinar, Lessons and Milestones in New Zealand Philippine Relations, and to welcome our speaker, the New Zealand Ambassador to the Philippines, Peter Kell. I have to admit that I myself know very little about New Zealand, other than what is known about it through popular culture. That, for example, the Lord of the Rings director Peter Jackson and the pop star Lord are from there. And dear students, if you're unfamiliar with their very young and dynamic Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, you should look her up. She's very young and dynamic. I do, however, know that New Zealand has a sizable Philippine population and that some of our graduates from the Institute of Nursing, quite a number of them, have migrated there and have found jobs and good lives in New Zealand. So I myself am quite eager to listen to the talk today and to Kell to this webinar and to thank him for taking the time. Actually wish that it could have taken place in FEU itself, as we are all very proud of the FEU campus and would have loved to show it to you. The FEU campus is a UNESCO Asia Pacific Heritage Site, noted for its 5 Art Deco buildings built in the 1930s and lovingly preserved by all of us. It also has a lot of Philippine art on its grounds and works kind of like an open museum. I would like to tell the ambassador also that I am particularly proud of our international studies students, many of whom are here today. They have consistently been among the most articulate and well-informed of our students. So Ambassador Kell, please allow me to give you an open invitation to visit FEU soon when things are better. We would really love to tour you around the campus. The grounds are beautiful. We're very proud of it, and show you the art, and maybe find a chance for you to meet some of our bright-eyed students. And to the students, thank you very much for being here today and surging on with your learning despite these difficult times. So thank you all. I will be listening in, though I think I will kill my video. Welcome all.
All right, thank you very much, SB Tino. Now, to give us the rationale of our program this afternoon, followed by the introduction of our speaker, let's all welcome our department program head, Mr. Francis M. Esteban, and one of our professors in international studies, Mr. Wayne Winter Oseco.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Ambassador Peter. The Ambassador's Lecture is one of the flagship seminar programs of the Department of International Studies of Far Eastern University. As the name implies, it aims to host distinguished foreign and local ambassadors so that they may share the relationship or the current trends and issues surrounding the relationship between the Philippines and their respective country. More so, by doing these ambassadors lectures, we do aim to inspire our students that maybe one day or someday they would be future global leaders themselves, contributing to the betterment of the world. So to introduce our speaker, may I call upon our colleague, Mr. Wayne Iseko.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Kiko. So our speaker this afternoon was the Deputy Head of Mission and Consul General at the New Zealand Embassy in Tokyo from February 2015 to April 2019, and also Acting Ambassador from April to July 2019. Before that, he served in Wellington for 5 years in the Human Resources Division and Chief Executive's Office before undertaking a secondment to the office of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. His last role in Wellington was as Principal Advisor to the Deputy Secretary of the Americas and Asia Group. He is a graduate of Kyoto University and Victoria University of Wellington. Before taking up his assignment in Manila, he spent 3 months on intensive Filipino language training, and his interests include singing, playing guitar, fencing, and karate. He is married to Rico, a Japanese national, and they have 2 teenage sons. We are indeed very lucky to have him as our speaker this afternoon's lecture. So without further ado, let us all give him a very warm welcome, His Excellency Peter Kell, the Ambassador of New Zealand to the Philippines. Sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Wayne Winter Ulisco. And also thank you very much for those kind remarks by Dr. Maria Teresa and Mr. Francis, and those kind of thoughts. But can I just say that I'm delighted to be here, and I would like to add my voice to those who have just spoken in welcoming and thanking the students for also being in this seminar today. But perhaps I might just start by greeting you in Māori very briefly, and then I will just explain what I'd like to cover in this presentation. Kia ora tātou katoa, e ngā manga, e ngā mihi, e ngā rauranga tira mā, tēnā koto, tēnā koto, tēnā koto katoa. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Karangalan kong makasama kayo ngayong hapon. Ako si Peter Kell, Ambassador ng New Zealand dito sa Pilipinas. Okay, so I'd like to talk about, first of all, introduce New Zealand to you, just very briefly, in case there are some who are not so familiar about New Zealand. Then I'd like to talk about New Zealand's foreign policy. And then I'd like to touch on the relationship between New Zealand and the Philippines. And then lastly, I'd like to finish off talking about how New Zealand has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. So four topics really: introducing New Zealand, introducing New Zealand's foreign policy, introducing the relationship between New Zealand and the Philippines, and then introducing how New Zealand responded to COVID. So New Zealand, the first topic. I think you all know where New Zealand is. We're literally the last country on the way to the Antarctic, down southwest part of the Pacific. Our closest neighbor is Australia. We're a very small country. We have a population of about 4.9 million people, just under 5 million people. Our history, we are probably the youngest country in the world. And what I mean by that is we were the youngest country to be formed, geologically speaking, and we're also the last country to be peopled. About 900 years ago, the first Māori settlers arrived in New Zealand. And then the first Europeans arrived in 1642. And that was a Dutch traveler, a mariner called Abel Tasman. After Abel Tasman arrived in New Zealand, it was quite a long time before the next European came to New Zealand. And that was Mr. Captain James Cook. He arrived in New Zealand in 1769. And from that point on, New Zealand was known and received many visits by whalers and traders. So fast track a couple of hundred years to a very important day for New Zealand, and that is the 6th of February, 1840, when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed between Maori chiefs and the British Crown, the Queen of England. So from 1840, in effect, we were a colony of Britain. But in 1907, the United Kingdom granted New Zealand a semi-independent status, what we call a dominionship. So New Zealand became a dominion of the United Kingdom in 1907. But it wasn't really until 1947 when New Zealand passed a law that made it fully independent. So we really became a fully independent nation in 1947 through the signing of that law. And that law was called the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act. So when you think of New Zealand, I'm sure you think of many things. Lord of the Rings, our beautiful landscapes, sheep, and if you're into sport and if you're into rugby, you'll think of rugby. And indeed, in terms of the way we, get income, our primary sources of revenue, it really does revolve around agriculture, tourism, and education. The backbone of our economy is really agriculture. And so we're predominantly known as an agricultural powerhouse. But of course, there is so much more to New Zealand. Now, I suppose it's really important because it kind of flows into how we conduct our policy in global affairs. But what are some of the values that, we New Zealanders associate with ourselves? And I think the first one I would like to call is integrity. We value human rights. We're the first in the world for Human Freedom Index. It's a survey conducted by the Fraser Institute in 2019. We champion democratic values. According to the Economic Intelligence Unit, their World Democracy Index for 2019, we were fourth, based on 5 measures: electoral process, civil liberties, how the government functions, political participation, and the political culture in New Zealand. We're also known for our approach on anti-corruption and transparency. So we are, according to one survey, the International Budget Partnership, we are ranked first place for accountability around the world for government budget transparency. According to a Danish company, Transparency International 2019, we are ranked first in the world in the Corruptions Perception Index. And we're also known for making it easy for our businesses to do business in New Zealand. So we have topped the ease of doing business rankings. These are done by the World Bank and the IFC every year. And we have topped that ranking in 2018, 2019, and 2020. But we're also very, very well known for our approach to diversity and inclusion. We were the first country in the world to give women the vote in 1893. In fact, the head of our government, as Dr. Maria referred to, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, is a woman. The head of our state, that is to say the representative of the Queen in New Zealand, is a woman, and the head of our judiciary is also a woman. So we prioritize equal participation in our society. We also value the Maori culture and the Maori people. You may recall that I referred to that treaty signed in 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi. That's an incredibly important moment in our history because it really was the first formal indication of a partnership between the Maori and the immigrants who followed afterwards and then became New Zealanders. And that's formed the basis for New Zealand's current government policies and society's approach to race relations, particularly between the Maori people and the rest of New Zealanders. Yeah, we are a diverse population. I mean, we're only what, 5 million people, but actually 25% of our population was born overseas. We have 200 different ethnicities living in Auckland, our largest city. And by 2038, over 50% of New Zealand's population will be Maori, Asian, or Pacific. We also have 3 official languages. And so I spoke 2 of them just before, Maori, English, but also we recognize and acknowledge sign language as an official language. And I would just ask you to think about that. Like, what's, why sign language, but also what does that tell you about a people who are prepared to make that an official language? So I see that as another indicator of our approach to diversity and inclusion. We're also known, and we believe very strongly in the importance of guardianship of other people, but also resources. And we use a Māori phrase to define that. We call it kaitiakitanga, kaitiakitanga. And we believe that we've been entrusted with the environment and we have a duty of care to the environment. How does this manifest itself? What are some of the examples? Well, I think for me, a very telling one is the fact that in 2014, New Zealand recognized a river that is very special to the Māori people. And the river's name is Whanganui. In 2014, New Zealand recognized that river as a legal person, as a living being. Doesn't get any better than that in terms of how we view the environment. But we're also passionate about, for example, whales. We're an active member of the International Whaling Commission. We have also been an active member proposing a whale sanctuary in the South Pacific. And we also have our own whaling sanctuary off the coast of New Zealand, near a place called Kaikoura, where incidentally, if some of you have been to New Zealand, you may have had the chance to do some whale watching in Kaikoura. More recently, this government has announced a policy to become 100% renewable in terms of our electricity grid by 2035. And also, this government has announced that it aims to transition to a low carbon economy by 2050. So yet again, examples of policies that reflect our values of guardianship of environmental resources. So I'm now going to switch to talking about our foreign policy for a little bit, yeah? So, well, let's talk about our region. And so ASEAN, APEC, and the Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. So this year we have celebrated 45 years of our formal relationship with ASEAN. We became a dialogue partner of ASEAN in 1975. And since then, the areas of cooperation and mutual interest have grown to where we now have built a solid partnership. The New Zealand government continues to stand with ASEAN as a partner in the Asia Pacific, and New Zealand supports ASEAN's centrality. We also have a a very large development partnership with ASEAN. We have committed 225 million New Zealand dollars, which in Philippines pesos equates to roughly 7.2 billion, in development assistance to ASEAN in the current triennium, the current 3-year period. ASEAN countries have been very clear about our value and our expertise in agriculture, renewable energy, disaster risk management, as well as English language training. Our aid, our assistance in agriculture and geothermal energy in particular, has also provided as a long-term catalyst for partnerships between businesses in ASEAN and New Zealand in these sectors. The Asean-Australia New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. In 1975, two-way trade between ASEAN and New Zealand was worth 133 million US dollars, which is about 6.6 billion Philippine pesos. Now, that amount represents less than 3 days worth of trade today between ASEAN and New Zealand. Last year's total trade with ASEAN was close to nearly 19 billion New Zealand dollars, or 615 billion Philippine pesos. So the Asean-Australia New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, which came into force in 2010, provides a strong foundation for us to continue strengthening our close economic partnership. In 2021, next year, New Zealand will host the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, but we will do it completely virtually. New Zealand was a founding member of the APEC. The Asia-Pacific's strong economic growth and increased demand for New Zealand products makes these links in the Asia-Pacific region vital. APEC represents 71% of New Zealand's two-way trade. In 2019, 73% of New Zealand's total exports went to APEC members, while 70% of the imports into New Zealand came from these economies. 18 of 19 free trade agreements we have are with APEC partners. And APEC also provides New Zealand with an equal voice with some of the biggest economies in the world, the US, China, for example. So what about our relationship with China? Well, China is already New Zealand's largest source of foreign students and our fourth biggest tourism market. It's our largest trading partner in goods and second largest trading partner overall, including trade and services. We have a New Zealand China Free Trade Agreement, which was signed in 2008, and that was China's first free trade agreement with a developed country. China is one of the world's fastest growing economies, and its vast population and growing middle class represent huge potential. But we have relationships, of course, with other countries. Australia and the US, brothers in the region. Australia is our closest and most indispensable partner in this respect. Overall history and shared values have shaped our most enduring partnerships between New Zealand and Australia. As a small state, New Zealand cannot do everything in the Pacific alone. We need partners. And so our shared history, our shared values and institutions, personal connections, geographical proximity, and a healthy sporting rivalry combine to make New Zealand's relationship with Australia our closest and most significant. We also work together in pretty much every area of government, including on trade and economic issues, and in defense and foreign policy. Australians and New Zealanders make up more than 2.5 million short-term visits across the Tasman each year. And there are really large resident populations of New Zealanders in Australia and Australians in New Zealand. Although we retain distinct cultural identities, close historical ties, family links, and friendships, these have all helped to shape a very strong sense of kinship and shared values between us. In 1951, New Zealand, up until that time, was a partner and part of a security treaty called ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, and the US. But in 1986, the US suspended security obligations to New Zealand. So from 1951 up until 1986, we were in the security treaty with Australia and New Zealand and the US. But in 1986, the US suspended its obligations to us. That said, the US remains a close strategic partner, and we work very closely on issues of common concern, such as safeguarding the environment in Antarctica, working to ensure a stable and secure Asia-Pacific region, and on addressing counterterrorism. As you know from my experience, having just spent 4.5 years, I couldn't really conclude this part on foreign policy without referring to our relationship with Japan. But needless to say, Japan is one of our, actually probably the most mature and long-standing relationship we have in Asia, particularly in North Asia. It's one of our largest markets for goods and services, and the government has committed to strengthening that relationship even more over the next few years. But really, the area where we see as very much in New Zealand's sphere of interest and influence is the Pacific. And, you know, New Zealand is a Pacific country. We're linked by history, culture, politics, and demographics. Roughly 1 in 5 New Zealanders have either Maori or Pacific heritage. The Pacific is a region of opportunity and empowerment where Pacific countries want to stand on their own 2 feet as equals, make their own choices, and have their distinctive voices heard on the global stage. So why is the Pacific so important to New Zealand? Well, the first is, for the reasons I've just outlined, identity. We see ourselves as very much having a Pacific identity. 2, national security. In a way, any threats to New Zealand have to come through the Pacific. So we have, you know, a very clear understanding of the need to ensure that the Pacific region is stable for New Zealand to remain stable. And 3, shared prosperity. We are very keen to ensure that not only do people in New Zealand share in the prosperity dividend, but also our cousins and friends in the Pacific, largely because of the very large population of Pacific Islanders living in New Zealand. At the same time, New Zealand is proud to be full members of the Pacific family and to have played a significant role in assisting the region to meet its challenges over the past generation. As part of the Pacific family, New Zealand is conscious that our identity, our national security, and our prosperity are inextricably linked. So we have, in a very genuine sense, a shared Pacific destiny. And I think, you know, in terms of destiny, I mean, future problems, climate change is one. And in this sense, we, together with countries in the Pacific, work closely together to tackle the priority areas that are associated with climate change. And lastly, I talked a bit about our development program for ASEAN. Just to put it in context, 60% of our development program is focused towards the Pacific. Okay, so maybe this is a good time now to pivot to the Philippines and talk a bit about the New Zealand relationship with the Philippines. So next year, 2021, New Zealand and the Philippines will celebrate 55 years of diplomatic relationships. The relationship has really grown in the past few decades, and we now have, a very large population of Filipinos and Filipinas living and working in New Zealand. By latest counts, around 80,000. And that's roughly 2% of the entire population of New Zealand. So it's pretty big. What's been driving it? Well, people-to-people exchanges and the establishment of a direct air link. Pacific Airline has a direct route between Manila and Auckland, has really accelerated that growth in people-to-people exchanges between our two countries. By the end of the year June 2019, so 12 months up to June 2019, 35,417 New Zealanders had visited the Philippines. And this represents roughly a 10% increase from the previous year. On the other hand, 27,857 Filipinos visited New Zealand in the same period. And that was double the numbers for the year 2015. So we really have seen in the last few years this tremendous growth in flows of people between our two countries. In terms of the trade though, so the Philippines was New Zealand's 15th largest export market in the year ending June 2019. Our largest export industry is milk, butter, and cheese, which comprises the bulk of our trade, and that's followed by wood products, paper, and beef meat between New Zealand and the Philippines. The Philippines, by the way, is the 4th largest market for New Zealand in terms of dairy produce, so it's a very important market for us. In terms of what we import from the Philippines, well, our biggest import was bananas. We really like Filipino bananas. In the early years, the relationship between New Zealand and Philippines really was clustered around our development activities. They were concentrated on helping the Philippines develop geothermal and electricity, focused on Leyte and Negros. Today, the cooperation exists between our two countries on geothermal, but it's now taken over by the business companies. We've been active here in the Philippines through our development program for about 50 years. And the focus has included dairy, reforestation, gender equality, Indigenous rights, ecotourism, peace building, and youth empowerment. We also have quite a stake in working with the Philippines government to improve and strengthen capability, which is just another way of saying that we invest in scholarships and short-term training opportunities for Filipinos in New Zealand. Every year, we award roughly 24 scholarships for postgraduate studies in New Zealand. At the moment, we have about 2,500 students from the Philippines studying in New Zealand. Okay, so I would like now to maybe just talk a little bit about COVID. I mean, really, that's the big thing, yeah, for the whole world. And just wanted to talk a little bit about how New Zealand has, addressed that challenge. So New Zealand has relied on evidence, science, and clear communication to manage the pandemic and break the chain of transmission in New Zealand. The public health response has included widespread testing and contact tracing of confirmed and suspected cases. The New Zealand government made the decision to go hard and go early because our modelling suggested that we were facing a crisis if we didn't take action quickly. That is, our healthcare system would be overwhelmed. That was the crisis. So the actions we took included closing borders, requiring isolation for people returning from overseas, putting in place an alert system, and placing the country under alert level 4, a complete lockdown, while we had comparatively low confirmed cases of COVID-19. The overall response in New Zealand was promoted as a collective community effort to unite against COVID-19. There was overall pretty high compliance with the alert levels in New Zealand, and the compliance has really been largely a matter of trust. Many New Zealanders were willing to play their part by staying at home and observing the protocols of the government. Our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, has been very clear that this has been a New Zealand-wide effort. As she likes to say, we are a team of 5 million, and the response is a collective effort. Clear and regular communication from the Prime Minister, the Director General of Health, and other leaders has been important for the effectiveness of the response. So how is COVID then, pivoting back to global studies and foreign policy, how has COVID affected our foreign policy? Well, firstly, our economic plan involves supporting businesses and workers through COVID-19 while investing to create jobs as we open up the economy and rebuild. We can avoid further crises by not repeating the mistakes of the Great Depression when countries withdrew from international cooperation. So the important point is that we need to embrace an open, free trading world in global cooperation as the best way forward for all people. So it's keeping global trade free and open. As the crisis has unfolded, in New Zealand, we were focusing on protecting New Zealand trade and supply links, so keeping those open at whatever cost. This was so that New Zealanders could continue to access essential goods, such as medicines, PPE, COVID-19 testing kits, and so on, as well as keeping New Zealand goods flowing to our trading partners. In terms of wider trade policy, our immediate response to this crisis has been a combination of trade diplomacy and reform. We have been making commitments with other nations to keep the flow of goods and services moving and to avoid supply chain disruptions. We are also working very closely with the New Zealand businesses that export. And we also work with the organizations that support and promote export. For example, the World Trade Organization, WTO, the United Nations, and APEC. And we're also refreshing our key trading relationships by pursuing free trade agreements and upgrades to existing agreements. So New Zealand will continue to strive to protect an open and inclusive rules-based order and seek opportunities to work collectively for the common peace, stability, and prosperities of all our countries. Health diplomacy plays a really key part now in the responsibilities of posts such as mine here in the Philippines. We have been delighted to be able to contribute to the efforts of the Philippine government and other players on the front line. Recently, we donated 800,000 pesos worth of money to the National Kidney and Transplant Institute to help it procure more PPE for its health workers. We are also working with the UN Migration Organization to provide a contribution to assist its efforts in Mindanao with a focus on balm to improve regional and community preparedness for future pandemics. Okay, so it's been a very quick thumbnail sketch of New Zealand, and then I've talked a bit about our foreign policy, and then I've talked a bit about the relationship between New Zealand and the Philippines, and then I've talked a bit about our response to COVID. And so I think I've probably given you enough information. I've talked enough at you, and I'm very willing to take questions or comments, but can I just say thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to now talking with you on some of the issues that I've raised and perhaps any other issues that you might want to ask an ambassador. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador Peter Kell, for inspiring all of us on how amazing New Zealand is. Perhaps since we weren't able to play the video earlier, we can play it after your talk, Ambassador, before I move on to our open forum, because I can see that we have several students who are excited to ask some questions from your discussion this afternoon. Okay. All right. Sir Kiko, are we good with the video? Okay, so while we're waiting for the video, just a rundown again of, are we ready, sir? Okay, sorry.
Welcome to the country of open spaces. Where nature bursts and flows. Where the elements come alive. Where there is room to breathe. And places to find. Welcome to the country of open hearts. Where care for the land and people is genuine. Where life is for living. Where time spent together is never time wasted. Where lasting partnerships are formed. Where strangers are treated as friends. And memories are treasured forever. Welcome to the country of open minds. Where learning is embraced. And opinions valued. Where freshness is championed. And quality prized. For the world to enjoy. Where nature inspires incredible thinking. Where ingenuity drives innovation. And productivity. Where big ideas are born every day. And new technologies are perfected. Where the impossible becomes real. And where every sunrise inspires the extraordinary. Welcome to the country of open spaces, open hearts, and open minds. Together, we can do amazing things.
All right. Thank you very much, Sir Kiko, for playing that video. And I guess our participants or guests this afternoon got inspired by the video played and wanted to see the Middle Earth soon. Okay. All right. So, Ambassador, if you're ready to entertain some of the questions of our students,
Absolutely.
allow me to read the first one. The first question is, What can New Zealand advise to the Philippines in terms of strengthening its relationship with its indigenous people?
Okay, well, so first of all, and this is something that I think for those who go into foreign affairs or other areas of similar nature, is that one of the things that we're actually extremely reluctant to do is to tell other countries what to do. Instead, what we like to do is talk about our own experiences and then allow our partner countries to pick out what might be suitable for them in their own situation. And the point behind that is that, typically speaking, problems are local, and therefore local problems need local solutions or homegrown solutions. And of course, there could well be best practice, but best practice is often very difficult to implement in exactly the same way in a whole lot of other countries. So you really do need to tweak and adapt the experiences of others to make sure that it's suited to your own experience. So I think for me, if I look at New Zealand and I look at our journey, and I would probably say that one of the things that's really been important in our own journey around Indigenous people is that you do need to talk, and you do need to consult, and you do need to have mechanisms for genuinely listening and talking about problems. And if you don't have those mechanisms in place, and I don't mean, like the once a year dialogue between or forum between, because those things are very important, but they're usually never enough. And therefore you really need to establish ways where you can tap into really what Indigenous people are thinking, and similarly what government is thinking and why they think that way. And so consultation, processes to be able to listen and then develop your knowledge of real motivations, real interests, real concerns that can then help shape your understanding of those issues, which and then can help inform your assessment of how to solve them, which can then form the basis of your recommendation to decision makers who will make decisions on actions to solve. And I feel that the really important part of all of this is the first step, and that is really being absolutely confident that you genuinely know what the issues are for Indigenous people as expressed and voiced through their eyes and their voices. And I think that New Zealand experience has shown that actually, we didn't do that very well until we decided as a government that there were grievances that the government had made against the Indigenous people in New Zealand, and that it was time for us to hear and listen and learn. And that, was the very first basic fundamental step that we needed for us to kick into action all these other steps that I've just talked about. So I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador. The next question we have here is from one of our professors, Professor Likayan. Good afternoon, Ambassador. My question is that how does this pandemic change the New Zealand-Philippines relations in terms of people-to-people relations?
That's a great question. I'll be brutally frank, we don't know. We very much value the community that we have in New Zealand, but we also recognize that, part of that community will be people who are tremendously affected by COVID, by the border restrictions that we have in place. And we are doing our best to see how we can manage the flow of people going forward. So we don't really know what the impact will be in terms of work, in terms of study, but we do know that we are very keen to be able to pick up all of that as soon as our border settings have changed, which means that we're allowing people to come back in. And we don't yet know what the situation in New Zealand will be like, but we are assuming that we will still continue to face challenges where we will need to draw on partner countries such as the Philippines, where there may well be people who, you know, don't have opportunities for work here, but may be able to work in New Zealand. So the short answer is we don't know. We certainly know that tourism and education will drop this year and probably into next year. But beyond that, we are hoping to see a resurgence and a pickup in numbers. But more importantly, that, you know, we can, I suppose, have this two-way. You know, we don't expect it to be one way to New Zealand, although the numbers have tended to grow from the Philippines to New Zealand. But we also have a lot of people coming up to the Philippines, and we are hoping that that will also make it easier in the future for them to continue their travel for either work or for study or for family reunion, which is a large feature of our travel. I'm not sure if that answered the question precisely. I'm very happy to, you know, talk further if there's a particular angle that you wanted me to talk to and touch on.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Next question we have here is from Senior Vice President Dr. Tino. You mentioned that New Zealand always ranks high on the World Democracy Index, and certainly New Zealand has a strong reputation for a strong and healthy state that is people-centered. How did it happen, given that New Zealand is such a young nation? Where does this tradition for strong democratic values come from? Did its colonial history have something to do with it? Does being in the Pacific have something to do with it? Were there specific figures who helped establish its democratic culture? It was also posted on the chat group. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, so I would say that New Zealand is a very young society. We're very young as a country, and therefore, and of course, as I mentioned at the outset, we were the last place on earth to be peopled, first by the Maori about 900 years ago, and then by the Europeans from, you know, late 1600. And colonization really took off in the 1800s. So you can imagine then that if you are a person arriving in New Zealand for the first time and you're going to live and raise a family and work here, then there are a lot, and there are no cities, there are no roads, there are no houses. You have to build all of that from scratch. You tend to prioritize values that allow you to get things done. And you tend to not worry so much about things that may have been important in your old country. And what I mean by that is that New Zealanders are known for being open and egalitarian. And I would argue that that has come from our pioneering history because, you know, we had no choice. And those people who couldn't get on with others, who weren't prepared to be open and share, who weren't prepared to allow all the members of the community who could contribute, if they didn't allow them to contribute, the future of the community was at risk. And people who didn't allow that sort of stuff to happen tended not to stay in New Zealand very long. So therefore, you have from very early days a practical reason for people to work together, not worry so much about traditional roles, and then just get on and survive and then live. So we're very pragmatic as well. And that probably has driven a lot of what you see in terms of allowing women to vote. It's because we, you know, have had women contributing to our society ever since they arrived in New Zealand because they had to. So I think it's some of those points that were made. Because we're in the Pacific, that's a bit of it. Certainly, as we had many more Pacific Islanders come in, they've introduced a new vibe into New Zealand society. I mean, speaking personally, my mother is Samoan. I'm half Pacific Islander. My dad was Australian. He was white Australian. So, and I can tell you that, you know, hand on heart, that Pacific Islanders have a very different vibe to New Zealanders who, you know, perhaps came out of Europe. And that's kind of gone into the melting pot of what makes a New Zealander today. So, but I think the last thing is that, you know, every community has its problems and people are people. So you know, you take any group of people and you're going to have lazy ones, hardworking ones, mean, nice. And I am sure that New Zealand in the early days was no exception, yeah? And I think we too, I think we should say that we too had our problems when it came to openness in government. And therefore, in the early 1900s, I think this problem was recognized and laws were passed to, in effect, improve the functioning of government. And I think now, 100 years later, you see the benefits.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. Our next question here is from one of our students. Question is, Ambassador, I would like to ask, since this is a lesson about the milestones in New Zealand and Philippine relations, what were some challenges that you have faced as a New Zealand ambassador to the Philippines? How did you overcome them? And lastly, Ambassador, do you have any word or words of motivation for the general public of the Philippines in terms of tracking this pandemic? It's from one of our students in international studies.
Yeah, okay, well, look, thank you again for the question. So I'm very new still in the role. It's 6 months. No, really? I started late January. And to be honest, I've spent more time now locked up than I have getting out and about. So actually a very real challenge for me is how to operate as an ambassador in a COVID-19 pandemic situation. You know, I don't have the opportunities to get out and meet people as I once did. So, I mean, that's a very practical challenge. But more broadly, I think the challenge, and you will find this, is that it's making sure any ambassador has this as part of their remit, and that is to make sure that they have access to the people that matter in the country in which they serve. And so for me, the COVID-19 has made it just a little bit more challenging to get out and meet people, even virtually, particularly if they're people I don't know. So access is always very important for ambassadors, because it's only when you know people that you can then, you know, have the conversations and discussions that can take forward relationships and the priorities that we both have for our two countries. So I think it's a very practical challenge. Actually, though, my focus has been more on the opportunities, because the Philippines-New Zealand relationship has just grown massively in the last couple of years. And actually, you know, before COVID came, it was poised to grow even more. So my challenge is how to ensure that that opportunity is not, you know, wasted away. And how can I ensure that where we were looking to really deepen some areas of the relationship, I can continue to do that even in a COVID environment. So that's the first part. The second is COVID-19 is a global issue. It's not a localized, it's not a thing that's just happening to New Zealand or just happening to the Philippines or just happening in China or Japan or Europe. It's happening to all of us. And so really, you know, we're all in this together. And the shout out that I would have for people in the Philippines and students at the other end of this is that, you know, lakas ng loob, we're all in it together. And, you know, sometimes we just have to persevere. And part of the perseverance is to follow the protocols that the public health authorities set, and just be kind to each other. And if there's one thing I've learned in my time in the Philippines is that, you know, Philippines are very kind. They're a very, you know, very friendly people. They work hard, and you know, they also play their role. And you know, the people that I've got to know obey the rules. And so I think we just have to keep doing that. And you know, at the end of the day, I am no different to you, in that we all have to do exactly the same thing to get through this. I'll teach you a Maori phrase, lakas ng loob, yeah? In Maori, we often say kia kaha, be strong. And we use that, you know, like if you're going to have a test, an exam, if you're going to play in a sports game, but if you're going through sickness or toughness, we always say kia kaha. So I'd like to say to you, kia kaha.
Okay, so something that we learned from today's discussion from Ambassador, kia kaha. Okay, and perhaps our students can also apply that in their everyday goings on in their academics. All right, Ambassador, can you still entertain more questions? We have a
Yes,
lot of
of course.
students who are very much interested to ask several questions from this discussion that we have. The next is from Bernard Garcia, our third-year student. New Zealand is one of the top countries fighting COVID-19 that contribute to the pre-existing issues such as societal order and poverty. How does New Zealand successfully control the cases of COVID-19, and how can the Philippines learn from it given that there is a huge difference between the said countries?
Yeah, look, and again, a great question. Look, I think, if I may, to be honest, my view of the national response here is actually that, you know, the Philippines government is doing all the right things. It's setting the right policies. The challenge, as I think, you know, you've just alluded to really, is that the implementation can vary from place to place, depending on the circumstances. And so that's where it gets very difficult. And there is no one solution. In the case of New Zealand, you know, we were, the way we responded and the direction that we took is actually no different to the direction that the Philippines government took. It's just that our community is different, and therefore the response was different. The implementation was different. And we had a whole lot of challenges that are actually no different to the Philippines. So a lot of our local health authorities were not well prepared to address a crisis of this scale. And so getting the right equipment to them proved to be challenging. And so we had to come up with our own ways of addressing that in precisely the same way that the Philippines government authorities, both national and local, are trying to address implementation challenges. And so the lesson is that I think actually people here, as well as in New Zealand, know what needs to be done, but how you do that will depend on the circumstances. And that's where you then really have to get the people involved in that situation, in that local area, to come together to work out how best to make that happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. We have another question here posted in our chat group from Jaya Gwen Lemke. What is your opinion about the spokesperson who said that the New Zealand model in combating COVID-19 is not applicable to the Philippines?
Yeah, look, I really don't have a comment on that. I suppose, if anything, it just reinforces maybe what I said earlier, is that each country is different, and each country has to, you know, come up with homegrown solutions to local problems. The challenge is global, but the way the challenge manifests itself in each community and each society is different. And we too look to Taiwan, Korea, Japan, China, to see how they had responded, and then we adapted that into our response. And so really, you know, I would just say that ultimately how each country responds really has to be aligned with the way the problems present themselves in that country for the solution to be effective.
Okay, and lastly, we have a question here posted by our very own program head. I'd like to ask a question in behalf of our graduating students. Higher education is very much excellent in New Zealand. Are there currently any available scholarships for application that our students can grab should they want to pursue higher studies?
Yeah, so we have, as I mentioned before, so the government provides scholarships in a number of areas for postgraduate studies. They tend to be in areas where we have value to add and needs have been identified here in the Philippines. We also have a geographic focus. I should add this. So roughly we have a third of the scholarships for the Luzon area, a third for Visayas, and then a third for Mindanao. And that's part of our effort to align with our value of diversity inclusion. And so I would very much encourage students who are interested in postgraduate studies. There are conditions, but to keep an eye on our Facebook page, because we do advertise all the opportunities that are available. And we also have, they're not scholarships, but we do have New Zealand universities that are actively promoting what courses they have to offer. for those who are interested in studying in New Zealand. But those are not all scholarship, opportunities. There will be some private. So I would just, thank people for their interest, and also say just keep your eye on the Facebook page and the web page of the embassy to keep abreast of developments in that space.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. Do we still have any more questions from our participants? Anyone from our students who still would like to ask Ambassador about New Zealand, about studying there, traveling to New Zealand? Okay, so if there are no more questions, just again a rundown. So Ambassador Peter Kell was able to discuss to us this afternoon a brief introduction about how amazing New Zealand is, the foreign policy of Australia, and it's also important to note that Ambassador mentioned about this, the first ever virtually APEC meeting, okay? And I think for our students who are about to take the subject on fundamentals of project management, this is something very beneficial for you to look at. Having that subject is in relation to events management at some point. Foreign policy of New Zealand, Philippines relationship, and how it responded to COVID-19. So again, thank you very much, Ambassador. And to formally close our event this afternoon, may we all welcome Dr. Rowena Capulong Reyes, the Dean of the Institute of Arts and Sciences, for the closing remarks.
Thank you, April. Can I just say one thing before the closing remarks, if you still have time, just a 10-second burst.
Sure.
Can I just say to the
Go ahead.
students, yeah, look, thank you very much for your interest. Look, I mean, the youth, we hear this a lot. Your famous hero, Dr. Rizal, said the same thing, but the youth are the future of the nation, and it's absolutely right. And I looked at your studies program, and that you're looking to create future global leaders. And really, leadership doesn't have to be in a global position or a role. Leadership starts at home in whatever you do. But the tools that you need to apply to become a leader are very important. So I'll just repeat it very quickly. Know stuff so that you can improve your understanding. And then once you can understand stuff, then you can form an assessment. And when you can assess, you can form a recommendation around what you should decide to do, which then flows into action. And that process you can do whether you're an ambassador or working in PR for Coca-Cola. And that's really part of the key of being a leader. And I just encourage you and wish you well on that journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Magandang hapon. Kamusta na po kayo? Magaling na kayo mag-Tagalog? Good afternoon, everyone. What a wonderful way to spend the afternoon with His Excellency Peter Kell, Ambassador of New Zealand. Thank you for taking the time out. Our appreciation to Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs of Far Eastern University, Dr. Maria Teresa Trinidad Tino. Ma'am, maraming salamat po. You're a busy woman, we know that. Thank you. I'd like to congratulate the Department of International Studies for making today happen. Program Head Francis Esteban, our moderator April Dopeño, faculty members, the IS Student Organization for another engaging activity for our students. As we promise all our dear international students, your Institute of Arts and Sciences will deliver services you're accustomed to, although now virtually. Today's sharing on New Zealand makes us appreciate good governance. It was really, I'm in awe of how the country is run. After all, this country has been ranked by 2017 Global Peace Index as the world's second safest country after Iceland, and they're comparing it with 162 countries. From your sharing alone, we saw that you have a very peaceful community. My neighbor migrated to New Zealand, and she said that by and large, the people of New Zealand are open-minded and believe people are all free to live a lifestyle that they choose. Your laws prevent people from abusing freedom of expression. Speech is commendable. You allow that. There's also freedom of movement, regardless of class, race, or living or non-living being. I'm very impressed with the respect you give to all. For a country to grant the same human legal rights to the third largest river in the world Wanganui, did I say it right?
Whanganui.
Wanganui speaks volume of how fair you treat everyone, creature, living or not, as I said earlier. I'm very impressed. And there's also, I was told, fair deal. In many countries like the Philippines, corruption is accepted, but not in New Zealand. Very good. You get exactly what you pay for in New Zealand. Now, the growth of the Philippine-New Zealand relationship, particularly the FEU-New Zealand relationship, is something to celebrate. I mean, your presence, I'm sure we can start something really big. And thank you for sharing your personal struggles to assume your role as the new ambassador to the Philippines. Like our international studies, now, as you mentioned, you do everything online, virtually. And I'm glad that you have mastered technology. You sharing your challenge and deepening the relationship. Maybe perhaps we can invite you to address a bigger audience, but this particular webinar is streamed live by our Department of International Studies. Now, you know, you mentioned about the Philippines being the 4th largest importer of dairy. You know, funny, growing up, I thought all the cows come from New Zealand. Your collective effort to fight COVID is really something that we should follow. I hope our government can look at how you handle it. Now, with the uncertain times we have right now, all that you have presented us makes, we wish we can have all of this for our country. You have exposed our students to the kind of governance, policy making, international relations, and your COVID response as key elements our country needs to become worthy for the Filipinos. Our students, as you said, are the future of this country. I mean, being exposed to this, perhaps they know what they should work hard for to achieve. They can dream, we can dream. They need to dream big for the Philippines. I'd like to end with a quote from Elijah Wood of Lord of the Rings. There's real purity in New Zealand. It's actually not an easy thing to find in our world anymore. So I'm so excited to visit your country. Again, good afternoon, everyone.
All right. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Dean Reyes. And again, thank you all for coming, for attending this webinar, and we hope to see you again in our next online event. Stay safe and see you again.
Thank you.
Very much, everyone. Thank you, Ambassador, and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Francis.
Thank you, Ambassador. Okay, everyone.
Okay.
Before you go out, everyone, since if there would be some time to open up your camera, so I'm just gonna take a very quick screenshot, if it's okay with you, so that we can have at least a virtual group photo.
Nice.
All right. So, some of our viewers are actually in viewing through their live streaming in our page, but nevertheless, all right. So once we took this photo, we can everyone can start leaving the room already. So everyone, smile. All right, very good. All right, thank you again, everyone. Once again, thank you very much, Ambassador, and have a good afternoon to each and all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.